Well, we're back in the dining room, and we're going to cover one more item and then talk a little bit about my mother's life and history, I guess. But she wants to point out something on the wall up there. You want to tell us about that?
The picture on the wall is a framed picture of a piece of needlework which we found in my husband's mother's apartment, Alice Maria Carlotta, Haddo, Cornwell. And we have no idea who made it or what its relationship is to the family, but it's a sampler made in 1797 by a person, a little girl named Christina Forrest. And you'd have to look on there to see what the date is. It's 1797, I believe, is the date on there, which would authenticate it. That was part of a young girl's education in the 18th century, was to go to a girls' school, usually taught by an elderly single lady, spinster they called them then, and they were taught how to do the various stitches and how to make the different patterns, and they were graded on it as their efficiency as a seamstress and as an artistic endeavor there. They learned to read, to write, and to do simple mathematics enough to keep household accounts. And that was considered a good education for a young girl. If she was musically talented, piano, violin lessons, or some other instrument that she wanted would have been included in her education.
Well, I want to ask you to relate your early life history some by answering questions that I ask you.
Hope I can remember that far back.
Well, just do the best you can. So tell us when and where you were born.
I was born on May the 9th, 1912, in Charlestown, West Virginia, in a little house which was part of a new development. Charlestown was supposed to be a growing town and was going to be a big metropolis. And my father bought this little house a block from my father's father, my grandfather Strider. And my mother and dad began their marriage there in that little house, and that's where I was born.
Where was this house? In the town? Or
it was in the town, in an area which is now called Ransom. Ransom began as a suburb, then it developed into an incorporated town of its own as of today. But it was supposed to be part of a very, very good look into the future and would grow, but it didn't.
And how did the family come to be on Altona then?
My father and my grandfather seemed to be very compatible. My father had several jobs. They were very young when my mother and father were married. They were only 17 and 18. And he worked as a rural mail carrier for a while. And then my grandfather offered them a house out on the farm. And he moved out and helped my grandfather in the management. My grandfather and my father were very close. They were very interested in the farming and everything concerned, and expanded it.
What was the name of this farm?
The farm was Altona, and it was owned by a family by the name of Davenport prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War, many of the Southern sympathizers were left impoverished, and he put it on the market. My grandfather bought it and moved out there in the late 1800s.
And what was their main crops?
The main crops, it was a farm of approximately 350 acres. And at that time, the best farming practices were, of course, rotated crops. They had several fields, one of which was hay, one of which was wheat, one of which was corn, and they would be rotated from one field to the other. 100 acres was saved for pasture. My grandfather and father developed a livestock business. They shipped meat to the abattoirs in Baltimore. They extended into the town and opened a grain and feed store. They invested in real estate in Charlestown profitably, and were growing with the town as it developed and became an important agricultural center. When we first moved out there, my father and grandfather used horses for pulling the farm equipment. From horses, they went to Tennessee mules, which were more sturdy, more hardy, and required less veterinarian attention. Later on, they moved to tractors, and later on, after that, they would rent and engage the combines, which would thresh the corn and thresh the wheat, and then they would move on to the neighboring farm. My father also had some beautiful Percheron horses, a team of 4, which he leased to the racetrack in 1930 when it first opened, and the horses would pull the starting gate. They were driven and ridden and managed by a man whom we called Uncle Jim. He was a black person who claimed to have been born into slavery during the Civil War, and later on was a laborer, day laborer, and worked on the farm for my father. The horses were very intelligent, and he would just speak to them, and they would know exactly when to begin the pulling of the starting gate and get it moved to a position for the next race.
What road is that farm on? It still exists, am I correct?
The farm still exists.
As a piece of property, or at least the main house does, with some land?
Well, go back a bit. The little overseer's house that my father and mother lived in, and where my 2 brothers, Charles and Nicholas, were born, was too small, so he built another house next to the big house for my mother and father, and they had a little stone put in it called Dream House, a little cornerstone, and that is where I grew up through my college years. We had horses, my brothers and I had ponies, and we rode and exhibited in the horse shows there. For 1 or 2 years, we rode ponies to school, and there was a stable behind the school where we would get them out of the weather during the time that we were in school. Later on, when I was about 14 or 15, my father purchased a little car called an Overland touring car. Very funny little Ford. It looked like a little funny Ford, but it was called the Overland. My father bought a very nice Chevrolet, which was the popular car at the time in competition with Ford. And there was a very funny story about my grandfather that they were the first, he was one of the first of 2 men who owned automobiles in Jefferson County. The other man was the doctor, who was our family doctor. And let's see, what else would you like to know?
Well, the name of the farm is Altona.
It's Altona.
And what road is it on, or route, or whatever?
It's on, I don't know the number of the route, but it's on the road to Middleway.
From Charlestown.
From Charlestown. And it is, the land is adjacent to the Samuel Washington home, which is called Harewood, because of the many birch trees which are on the property. Mm-hmm. And the descendants of the Washington family still live there. And they open the house on special occasions for historical tours and special tours that are arranged by a tour agent.
So what happened in the Depression, they lost this land or whatever, right? And tell us what happened then and how you came to Brookland Farm.
Well, as I say, we grew up there and enjoyed our riding horses. And I was part of a DAR group that were in the Apple Blossom Parade, and my father furnished the horses, and the DAR group rented the carriage, and various members of the DAR were impersonating members of the wedding of Dolly Payne Todd to James Madison. They were married in the living room at the Washington home at Harewood. Samuel Washington's 3rd wife was the sister of Dolly Payne Todd, which is why they happened to have the wedding there. Dolly Payne Todd being a widow, of course. So anyway, it's as of interest, and I have a picture of it that I rode side saddle, which was authentic at the period. And the DAR rented me a beautiful costume for the occasion. I was in high school at the time and went off to college after that in 1930. When I came home...
You went off to college where?
1930. Oh, Grinnell College
Grinnell
in
College.
Gainesville, Georgia. Very nice.
How did you get down there?
Oh,
By train?
no, my parents drove down in this Chevrolet, which was absolutely the latest.
Mine.
And after they had taken me down to be enrolled and get settled down, they came on back. And the rest of the time, I came home by train. And I had a friend from Wheeling, West Virginia, who would come in to go down. She was going to Grinnell, too. And we would meet in Harper's Ferry and go from there to Washington and change trains and then take the Southern down to Atlanta and then the local train up to Gainesville, Georgia. So that was my college. When I came home the summer of 1932, my parents had moved into a home which was loaned to them by a friend. The Depression had finally come. The Depression of 1929 had finally come to the little town of Charlestown, and a great many people lost almost everything they had, their homes and property. And most of the commercial dealings were carried on by trade and barter. The farm people would bring their products in, their butter and their cheese, and their, in the fall, their meats that they had butchered and cured for the winter, and trade them for staples like flour and sugar and so forth. And it was a very, very rough time. My father and grandfather had many, many outstanding creditors among the farmers who had bought feed from them at the feed store, who had bought livestock, who had made plans for doing what they would buy a young yearling in the spring and from my father and grandfather, and fatten it during the summer and sell it back to my father and grandfather in the fall to be shipped out to the abattoir in Baltimore. So everybody just had no money at all, and the business collapsed. The farmers couldn't pay. There was no way to make them pay. And so they sold the farm, Altona, and sold some of the real estate they owned in Charlestown. They sold the grain and feed business, and they sold the butcher shop which they had. So a friend of my father's said that I would love to have you come live in my house. His wife had died, and he said, if you let me stay there and have my meals with you, I will charge you no rent. So my father had managed to get enough money from the sale of all the things at the corporation, my father and grandfather, and my uncle, who was the son of Grandfather Wall. His name was Fred. The three of them had a corporation of the business called Wall, Strider and Wall. So they sold the entire business, and each had a little bit left, and my father purchased 52 acres on the Old Cave Road, which is 3 miles south of Charlestown. And my father started to build a house there, which he called Brookland Farm. And the rest of my growing up years were spent there. And I went to Shepherd College as a day student to complete my qualifications for a teaching certificate in West Virginia. And after I graduated, I got a position in the public school system in Charlestown. I taught English in the high school there until I met my husband, George, and we were married, and then I moved to Washington. So.
Were you teaching then in Charlestown when you met Dad?
Mm-hmm.
And when were you working for Mr. Collingwood?
After I moved to Washington.
Okay, so that was after you were married that you started working for him.
Yes.
And what was he doing, and what was your job there?
Well, during the last 1938-39, I decided I would take the adult night education course that they offered in the high school, something quite new at that time. in, they called it business education. I took typing and bookkeeping and office procedures and so forth. So when when I married, moved to Washington, I went job hunting, and through the employment agency, found a job with Harris Collingwood. He was a forestry engineer, worked for the National Lumber Company, and was called a forest engineer, and kept in touch with all the lumber manufacturers throughout the United States, and acted as a lobbying agency with Congress. And it was a very interesting job. He wrote a book while I was, the 2 years that I worked there. And he and his wife became very good friends with George and me. And I think we replaced their son, Charles Collingwood, who had gone to London at the beginning of the World War II to be in radio work, which was just beginning to broadcast national programs and keep up with the world and so forth. And he was there during the blitzing and the bombing of London, and it would be my duty to distribute his letters back to his father, to all the members of the family, so they could have the first-hand account of the World War II and of conditions in London. One of the buildings where he was living was bombed, and he started to get up and leave the building, go to the bomb shelter, and the side of his bedroom wall, just the bomb took it, and he was on the other side and got out and got to the bomb shelter. So it was such occasions as that he wrote about in his letters, and then everybody listened to his broadcasts. A certain time at night he would come on and tell what was going on in London with the Blitz, and he later became a very important correspondent.
Well, tell us about how you and Dad first met on some date to a hockey game or something,
Yeah.
such thing. How did you
Well, we
all the way from Charlestown or whatever to do that?
in 1940, the economy was beginning to bounce back in West Virginia, and they decided to build a elementary school in the mountains, which were east, across the Shenandoah River, east of Charlestown. And they employed an engineering firm from Washington. And the resident engineer in charge was a young man about my age named Raymer Bennett. Well, on the high school faculty, I was the very youngest person, and in fact the teachers that were on the faculty with me were teachers who had taught me earlier. So anyway, there weren't too many people my age in Charlestown, and Raymer and I started dating. He was a lot of fun and was interested in the things that I was. So he had gotten tickets to an ice hockey match in Washington, and asked me if I wouldn't like to come down and go. So I had two aunts in Washington, one of whom, Aunt Jane, was my favorite, and I'd always stay with her when I went to Washington. So I came down, and Raymer had driven down earlier, and I came down on the train, went to Aunt Jane's, and while Aunt Jane and I were at dinner, Raymer called up and he said, "You'll never guess what happened today." He said, "I ran into an old friend of mine that I was working on the Library of Congress with, and he has a date for the hockey matches too. Would you mind if we double dated?" And I said, "Oh no, I thought that would be fun." So of course his old friend from another job turned out to be my husband, George. So I met him, and we had lots of fun conversation at the hockey match, and later on we went to a place on Connecticut Avenue, which was where all the young people went after movies and on days called Napoleon's. And to give you an idea of the economy of the time, there was a flower vendor in front of Napoleon's selling gardenias for 25 cents each. And my husband bought one for his date and one for me. And that was where it all began.
And this is where it is today.
Yeah, and here is where it is today, 56 years later.
So how did you ditch your date?
What a good date. That's
Well,
right.
do you remember what the first contact was then between you and George Cornwell after that evening? How did that come about?
Well, he knew that I had come down just for the weekend and lived in Charlestown. And he asked me when I was coming down again, and I said, well, I didn't know. And he said, well, when you do come, I would like to see you, take you out. So when I came down, we dated and went to movies. And then we had one of the most stupendous dates of the time. The movie, Gone with the Wind, was the first movie, the longest movie, and they were selling reserved seats at a fantastic price of, I think, $10, which is what a movie ticket costs now, I guess. And he said, come down and I'll get tickets for Gone with the Wind. So we went with some other friends of his, a fraternity brother and his wife, to Gone with the Wind, and they had intermission, and it was a very lovely performance and very exciting. I got off early from school on Friday and took the train down to Aunt Jane's, and then George came over and picked me up, and we went to the program, and then we made plans for him to come up to Charlestown to see the Brookland Farm and Harper's Ferry and all the other interesting things there. And it was rather coincidental. As a little boy, George's father had an orchard which he owned near Carneysville, which is a little town about 5 or 6 miles west of Charlestown. And I didn't know it at the time, and he didn't know me at the time, because people didn't visit very much back and forth as they do now. And everything was done mostly by horseback in the late 1918, 1920, and the early 20s. So from there, we just began seeing more and more of each other, and decided, he proposed to me, of course, and it was very romantic. And he gave me an engagement ring in the Christmas of 1939. We were married in May of 1940.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you had to do to get the wedding preparations made? And you had told me in the past about having to decorate the church and where you were married and what you did
was decorated. I did it with the help of one of the farm hands who worked for my father.
Well, you got married in
I got
Charlestown.
married, George and I were married in Charlestown in the Presbyterian Church, which was built in 1797. And it was a beautiful little brick church with white columns and historic. Now it is about 3 times that size with additions of the growing congregation of the church. But the only flowers that were available at the time were lilacs, so we had the church decorated with bouquets of lilacs and the evergreens, and of course it was done a day or 2 before the ceremony, and the church was closed, so that when it was open for the wedding, there was the fragrance of lilacs and evergreens. Mm-hmm. And I brought a bouquet of white roses. George's sister Betty was my maid of honor, and we had a reception at Brookland Farm after the wedding, and then we drove down to Washington. And I had moved down some of my furniture from my bedroom and some things that I had inherited from my great-aunt Kate, and had the apartment all furnished. So we came down to Washington and went to the apartment and had a few days together getting settled, and then George went back to work and I started job hunting. And that September, we had our honeymoon. We went to New York and went to the World's Fair and had loads of fun. That was the thing to do at that time.
Who was it that helped you with all these greenery? And
Sammy Harris.
I've heard that name.
He was the son of Liza, who helped my mother in the kitchen and with the cleaning and the laundry and so on.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell us now about your brothers and how they came along and what they did briefly in their lives? Well,
my brother, who was 2 years younger than I, Charles Howard Strider Jr., named for my father, was the first of my 3 brothers to be born, and he was born, I guess, he was born in the small overseer's house at Altona. And he went out to West Virginia University and wanted to be a mortician and had just started training for that. He'd gone to the University of Minnesota for his degree in, I guess, mortuary science, they called it at the time. And had come back to look for a job. He was working for a funeral home in Washington. And World War II developed and broke out, and he volunteered and went into the Army Medical Corps and had duty out in the Pacific at Guadalcanal and in the Philippines, and I think partly in New Zealand for a brief time, and came back to Charlestown after the war was over and established his own funeral home with a friend of his, Charles Smith. He married a school friend, Janie Webster, and they built a home across the road from Brookland Farm where my parents had built. And he developed colon cancer and died, I would guess, about 1990, 1991. I'm not sure of the date. The second brother was Nicholas Samuel Jacob II, named for my grandfather Strider. He also attended West Virginia University and later on came down to Washington and finished and got his degree in accounting at Benjamin Franklin University. The war was imminent, of course, and he applied to West Point for admission there and didn't get it, but he was selected for West Point Training School and had a year there and went into the Army Finance Corps as a second lieutenant. He saw duty in Germany, was in the Battle of the Bulge, and came back, and he married a girl by the name of Enid Willard, who was working for the Justice Department in Washington. And they were married, I think, about 1942, 42 or 43, in Washington, and they have had duty in many places, Germany and Texas and so forth. The third brother was born much, much later, David Valentine Strider, and he was 13 years younger than I, and had a rather lonely growing up because Nick and Charles were gone, so was I. And David decided he wanted to go to the University of Virginia Medical School. And he was about halfway through that when World War II began. And he enlisted in the B-12 program, which permitted him to get his medical degree, and then he went on duty with the United States Navy as veteran member of the Medical Corps. He paid back his V-12 program time and went back to Charlottesville and opened a practice as an orthopedic surgeon. He married a classmate from high school, Betty Falk, and they're retired and living now in Charlottesville. So Charles and Janie had no children. Nick and Enid had 4 children, and David and Betty had 3 boys. And they all now have grandchildren, as do I. Very wonderful grandchildren.
Well, our battery power is running out.
Oh, it is.
Everybody's energy is still a little bit, I suspect.
And my chattering is getting very detailed and involved.
Thank you very much for showing us the house and telling us all about the early history of your family.
Well, I certainly enjoy doing it. You know I love to talk, and I love this old house. Every direction I look, the things I see have memories of where they came from, how we got them, who they belonged to previously, and the fun we've had living here with them, and the fun we've had here watching our wonderful children grow up.
And the only last thing we have to do is give credit to our camera girl.
Our camera girl is one of my wonderful grandchildren, Stephanie Elaine Cornwell, who is now a television anchor.
We can hardly see because she's all backlit.
Well, this is a typically dark Victorian house.
Which I've been telling you about because I'm the camera girl.
Oh, what was he knocking over?
Nothing.
This
You just
place has
moved
got
hurricane shade. That's
too
all.
much stuff in it.
Hi, I'm a granddaughter. I'm just a camera girl.
And,
I mean, you
well,
can,
I think we're out here because the battery
The
is
light,
giving me
red
the
light's
big,
still
it's just
on.
the
giving
big
me
X.
it's still recording.
Oh. So when was all of this done, Stephanie?
This was done on December 26, 1996.
And what are you going to do this afternoon?
I am going to a musical for my birthday with my mommy
Okie dokie.
in National Theater.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.